Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, and we have John Bristow here with me from Octopus Deploy. And today we're going to be talking about the state of software deployments with Octopus Deploy. And of course, we're going to talk about the various tools and techniques that fall into the .NET ecosystem that you just have to have in place to take full advantage of Octopus Deploy. But we're gonna dive right in because we have a lot to cover and a short time to get there. So just real quick by introduction, Measure is an Octopus Deploy consulting partner for North America, and we're a software architecture company, and we love empowering software teams to be highly effective. And we focus on Microsoft software teams that are using Visual Studio to do their development, .NET teams. And so you can find us at clearmeasure.com. Anything that we talk about, if you want to get it later, or if you're even watching the recording of this later, just go onto our website. There's a contact form, and you can ask for those resources there. And of course, you can go to octopus.com and you can see all of the different partners all over the world. And of course, for North America and USA, you'll see Measure right there. A past webinar that was really fun, I did with Paul Stovall, the founder of Octopus Deploy, and we talked about database DevOps. And so you can go back and look in the webinar archives, and it's on Measure archives. It's also on the Octopus archives, but we put a short link there for you, bit.ly/Octopus database, if you want to go and look at that webinar. That was kind of fun. So our agenda today, we want to kind of help you think and understand about the state of automated deployments and DevOps today. So we're going to go into some information, but then we're also going to demonstrate the latest in Octopus Deploy with a containerized application, as well as config as code and infrastructure as code, and how all of those features fit together to support trunk-based development when you're doing automated deployments, but you might have any number of feature branches going at one point in time. So that's kind of what we're gonna get to here. And now I'm gonna just kind of hand it off to John to just give us the overview state of software deployments.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jeffrey. Hello, everyone. I'm John. I'm at Octopus Deploy. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out. Happy to connect at any time. I thought I'd set the stage here and talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the broader ecosystem today. So we have many thousands of customers who do many, many deployments. Some do a few deployments a day, some do a few thousand a day, even hundreds a day. And I'd like to give you a lay of the land of what we're seeing out there in the ecosystem, because I thought it would be really good to set the context around this. And so, the state of software deployments is pretty easy to understand from an Octopus perspective. So if you take a look at, where software is being built and how developers are building it, they basically utilize, a variety of tools in their tool chain. So things like for doing build and testing and packaging up of applications. Where Octopus sits in that ecosystem is pretty much in the middle, where we do the deployment of software. So in the following slide, as Jeffrey will show you, it's basically where we position Octopus relative to that. So if you take nothing else from this presentation in terms of where Octopus sits in this pipeline, Octopus sits right where your packages are being deployed to production. And so on the left, we have our teams doing great work, building out code. They then utilize the CI server or pipeline for building out that code, and they use a variety of tools for that. And then at some point, they're going to go and say, hey, we've got to deploy this thing. And so that's where Octopus Deploy really participates. Now, part of that, of course, is being able to deploy to infrastructure and standing up that infrastructure as part of that. So there is an element of that. But if you take nothing away from this, basically, this is how we operate. And on the following slide, you'll notice that we're talking a little bit about a report here. So this is a report that was put out by the CD Foundation. The Continuous Delivery Foundation is basically a foundation that lists a bunch of open source projects and companies we're a member. And this was a report put together by Slashdata, and it's entitled "The State of Continuous Delivery." It's been done for 4 continuous years, and this is the latest version. This just came out last month, and I think it was a good reflection of what folks are doing out in the ecosystem around continuous deployment and continuous delivery. And I thought it would be interesting to mention here. these are some of the key highlights. The one that I want to draw your attention to is the top right corner. In the second column there, it says there's a strong correlation between the number of DevOps technologies used by developers and their likelihood to being a top performer across all three performance metrics. What that means is if you use more tools and you're using them in a process-based way with DevOps in mind, you tend to be a higher performing team. Now, that may be a little bit of a disconnect for some folks because they're like, well, wait, more tools means more complexity. Not necessarily. If you talk about pipelines, you talk about your build pipelines in terms of testing, and then you move over to the CD side of it with deployment. And then you can take into consideration things like observability and monitoring. These things turn out to be really, really important when building out software. So on the next slide, we see a chart that reflects some of this. And this is really a state of affairs relative to how people are using CI/CD tools and the change that's occurred since Q1 2022 to now Q1 2023. Now, the bars that are in light green are Q1 2022. And what you're noticing, the big outliers here is, first and foremost, self-hosted CI/CD tools saw a huge drop. What that means is a lot of folks are utilizing managed environments. So you're seeing a huge drop moving away from self-hosting with CI servers like Jenkins or TeamCity, moving towards the cloud. And that's not an indictment of those tools. Those are great tools. In fact, we utilize those tools ourselves. It just means that the maintenance and the amount of work necessary to host those things maybe not have the same payoff that you would like. Some other outlines, of course, is the fact that when utilizing these things and where we're seeing a big change in terms of DevOps technologies is, around issue tracking, source control, et cetera. So this is sort of the state of affairs relative to these things. And, there might be some surprises here, but when it comes to deployment, this is obviously an important aspect of your CI/CD pipeline. So on the next slide, we see a little bit of this reflected in that performance metric that I mentioned earlier. So if you're utilizing, on average, there's about 4.5 technologies used in a typical CI/CD pipeline. What this report states is that if you use anywhere around 10, you're going to see more likelihood for that team to be a higher performing team. So in this observation, basically, it said the more technologies you use, the better off you'll be relative to a DevOps strategy. And so in the next slide, we also see this also reflected in terms of that performance. So what you'll see here is that there's a bit of a nuance here, but those folks who deploy multiple times a day or happen to have a smaller lead time or a smaller time to restore, that sort of MTTR metric that we all know and love via DORA. If you're practicing those DevOps practices, you'll see a better performance relatively overall. Now, where it starts to blow out, obviously, is when you're not deploying that often, like say once per month, et cetera. We're seeing this reflected by our customers today. So we're seeing customers, as I said before, we have customers, many customers deploying multiple times a day. In fact, we have customers who deploy on demand. We have customers who deploy hundreds of times a day. And this is the norm for them. And it turns out to be a big win for them because it allows them to deploy quickly, allows them to deploy reliably. And this is part of the sort of case for Octopus in general. And so if we move off to the next slide, we can see that, when we're talking about here is the build pipeline. And we know we've all seen this Mobius strip. We all know and love this. This is part of the build pipeline. The stuff that we're talking about here is the things that go into those aspects. Now, this is where we sit typically as a development team. We know and love this place. Where Octopus sits relative to that is shortly thereafter. After you've gotten out of the build pipeline, you have an artifact or a package, then you're ready for deploy, which is what is demonstrated in the next slide. The way that we view the world relative to this is coders code, it goes into source control, stuff happens, and then a package comes out of it. The packages is what we ultimately care about, and that's what you go to deploy with Octopus. So if you take nothing away from this, ultimately what Octopus is doing is a bunch of stuff around packages, which is why we harness on it. So the next slide talks a little bit about, relative to Octopus, how we view Azure DevOps. And it's not a compete play. It's a Octopus and Azure DevOps. And as Jeffrey will quickly demonstrate here, it's a great story, and we hope that you'll be able to take advantage of it going forward.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So we're going to get right into that, and we're going to show a .NET 7 application, simple architecture. And by the way, take a screen grab of these URLs because 100% of the source code for this, 100% of the configuration for the pipeline configuration in Azure Pipelines and the deployment project configuration in Octopus Deploy are all available in here because they're stored in the Git repository. And then the third link is the UAT environment, one of the environments that's live right now in Azure that you can go and click on. But take a screen grab. If you miss these URLs, then we'll give them to you again. And of course, any questions that you have over time. Now, before we jump into it, we're just going to launch our quick poll because we'd like to understand, what version of .NET you're using, and then what your primary job is. Do you work on the software all day long in the code, or are you leading the team as well as writing code, or are you just overseeing the team and paying the bills, but not actually working on the code itself? So we'll give you a minute or so to click on that webinar poll, just so we can get a sense of our distribution across this webinar. And I'm going to dive in, and I'm going to start by showing you this in Visual Studio and then just walking forward all the different concepts that John talked about. And let's see, I think we got pretty good on the poll. So go ahead and take that out. Okay, so I'm going to just walk forward all the different concepts that John talked about from the start to the finish, all the way through every bit of deployment. So let's just show you real quick in Visual Studio. This is a full Visual Studio solution. It uses some of the architectural patterns of Onion architecture. We see that core library there, very thin, but this is also a Blazor WebAssembly application. And I wanted to just kind of highlight some of the artifacts that we tend to put into the application for the purpose of making it easier for deployment. Like John said, everything is a package once you get to deployments. And so if something is going to be in the package, then it has to be in source control, because at the tail end of a successful integration build, we're actually going to create those packages, which I'll show you. And so you see two different scripts, which I'll follow up on at the end. One is to check the version of the software, or check the version that this particular application thinks it is, to make sure that the version that spun up and started up at the end of a deployment is actually the version that we intended to deploy. It's one of the checks to make sure we have a good, successful deployment. Also, we have another PowerShell script that just calls the health check endpoint. And in .NET, one of the really popular libraries is the health check library, where you can write all kinds of interesting things to make sure that the application is healthy. And so, in Azure on the free tier, it's really easy to accidentally leave a free tier running, or not change. Once you upgrade to premium, you forget to change it to 64-bit process. And so here, our code just asserts, yep, we are running a 64-bit. And then, of course, in database, a health check to make sure that, guess what? The connection string actually got configured properly upon deployment. We can actually reach the SQL Server database. And so just little tiny bits of code run, and we can ask at any time if the application is healthy. And I'll show you that at the appropriate step. So this is the Visual Studio solution. And if we were just to kind of share the GitHub repository, I gave you the URL for that GitHub repository there. And you can see that we have our Azure Pipelines.yaml file for that configuration, and we have our .octopus. Now, as a bonus, I'm not going to show you that today, but as a bonus, we also have our .github directory. So if you want to use this with GitHub Actions, you know what? Sample configuration is right there in that folder that you can snag as well. But if you're not familiar, actually, I'll show you this one first. If you're not familiar with Azure Pipelines.yaml, then one of the key steps that is super important is when you actually call over to Octopus Deploy to create the release. And I'm going to show you visually what that looks like, but you literally use this task provided by Octopus. And one of the key things to make this compatible with automated testing, which I'll also show you, is this setting, deployment progress true. And then all of the logs that are available in Octopus Deploy also get streamed over and are stored in Azure Pipelines as well, so that you can see all the logs aggregated together. All right, so before we exit source control, the .octopus folder. This is where the entirety of the configuration for your deployment project is in Git. And the process, I'm just showing you one of the steps here, where we are literally going to call that check version.ps1 file that I showed you in Visual Studio. And it's coming over as part of one of the release candidate packages. And it's a PowerShell file. And we put in some parameters. That is the URL to the actual running application and what version that we are expecting to see. And then there we go. Okay. So as we go along, let me just kind of show you the structure and then I'll pop back over. And by the way, if you grab this code, just get the latest version of Visual Studio 2222 and it will work. And of course, we are very close to .NET 8. This November is coming out, so that's moving along fast and furious. All right, again, this is the architecture of our application. And you can see that we also have unit tests and we have integration tests and we have full system acceptance tests. So we need to run those 3 different test suites in our testing pyramid in our pipeline. And a little bit more detail on the overview of the process that John showed is our detailed DevOps architecture. By the way, this is only the first top third of the full-size poster that you can see here on the screen. It's really meant to be a 2-foot by 3-foot printed poster. You can print it off at a print shop for your team. I'm going to go back just the top third. If you would like a high-resolution version, PDF of this entire DevOps architecture poster, just ask Melanie in the chat, or after the fact, just email us or contact us in some form or fashion, and we'll make sure you have it. But this is the integration of Azure Pipelines and Octopus Deploy. And you can see that we have our source control, and all these different callouts are what you need to make sure is enabled at every one of these stages. And so if we pop over to the continuous integration build, the output of the continuous integration build is packages, and we need to store those packages somewhere. And if you're in an application and you don't have any full system testing at all, then this next step isn't as important. But I do encourage you to have full system tests because full system tests have to be run against a fully deployed instance of your application. And so while for just deploying, sending the packages to the NuGet server inside Octopus Deploy works brilliantly. When you have full system tests, you need to store the package that contains your tests for that version of the application in some other package storage solution. Azure Artifacts works brilliantly inside Azure Pipelines, and so that's kind of what we have here. But either way, you're gonna package up all of your deployable parts of your release candidate. Once we get into the actual deployment, by the way, you need at least three environments. You're never going to have a DevOps pipeline with fewer than 3 environments because there's 3 distinct types of environments. You have your production, you need at least 1. A lot of people have more than 1 production environment. If you segment customers and you have, multiple, like Salesforce.com has almost a dozen production environments just because of the volume of customers, and they segment it that way. You need at least 1 production environment. Pulling back from that is our manual test environment. You need at least 1 of those. Again, many teams choose to have more than 1 manual test environment if you have different groups that need an environment to be able to test, but we need to do some manual testing. So you need at least 1 of those. And there's so many names for a manual test environment: UAT, test, stage, DIT, SIT, all kinds of, even teams that choose to have a development environment. If it's for manual testing, it's for manual testing. Pulling back from that, we need to have an environment for automated testing. Otherwise, you can't really run your full system tests. And we encourage you to have full system tests. Okay. And so we're gonna show how Azure Pipelines integrates with Octopus Deploy, so you have a full view of your entire pipeline. Now, a few things to think about upstream from Octopus Deploy, because if you make mistakes upstream, then it's going to be difficult to do automated deployments well. And the first types of decisions come in your Git source control. You want to have one logical application from an architectural perspective in your Git repository. Even if you've migrated your source control from SourceSafe or TFS or some other version control system, and you had this big directory tree with dozens of applications, and you just happen to know what part of the directory tree you're working on, you want to do some refactoring, because all of the tools in the DevOps ecosystem are really optimized to work with the entirety of a Git repository. And so make sure that you have one deployable application in your Git repository. Now, that application may have multiple deployable components like a SQL Server database, a web application, maybe some offline services that each need to be deployed independently. And that's all fine and normal, but together they have one version number. They are architecturally one logical application, even if it has 3 or 4 or even more deployable components to it. So that's really a really important upstream decision to get right. Now let's talk about process, and we're going to switch back over. Your continuous integration has 3 components: your private build for the commit stage, then your CI build for the integration stage, and then your full system tests and your first deployment. Going all the way back to 2006, when the canonical continuous integration book was published, it defined the methodology as having those 3 stages. And a lot of the build servers make it super easy to just trigger a compilation based on a source control change. And that's a good start, but that's not continuous integration. You got to have all 3 steps to get the benefit of continuous integration. Not going to go into all of that now, but the major steps are stamping a version number into the application, migrating the database or getting the database set up for the build process, then doing a compilation, running as much of your testing pyramid as you can, your unit tests, your integration tests, running your static analysis, and then you package up whatever needs to be deployed. Okay. And then you publish those. And so from a packaging perspective, you can see how an application with a web application, an offline job, and a SQL Server database translates to 3 deployable components. And then, of course, your full system acceptance tests are a 4th deployable component. Okay. And we can push those to the NuGet server inside Octopus Deploy, and we can also push our tests to Azure Artifacts. So I'm going to show you that real quick. The screenshot of the package manager and Azure Artifacts, but let me switch back over and kind of talk about this, talk about the pipeline. And now the pipeline view, as we come over here, we go into pipelines, the pipeline view shows all the different stages. And of course, if I were to just jump into here, it's no mystery that we have our build stage, our integration build stage, and then we have our first environment, second environment, third environment. Again, call them whatever you want, but you need a minimum of these 3 environments, because they all serve different purposes. And again, if you want 2, 3, 4 different environments for manual testing, that is perfectly fine. Do what you need to do, but this is the minimum. Okay. And so we can see we have tests that are run in the integration build. We also have tests that are run upon first deployment. Before I go into that, I'm just going to kind of show you back in our slides. All right, show you this. I just showed you in real time, so I'm going to skip over this. And as we jump forward, I'm not going to really spend a lot of time on integration build, because that's a whole nother webinar of its own. But of course, you have all of the configuration in the Git repository. You can look at that on your own. This is the TDD stage, and this is what we've chosen to call our first deployed environment, where we deploy and then we run full system tests. And so in Azure Pipelines, this is kind of the view, but the YAML for the Octopus create release is right here in the middle. And I kind of gave you a sneak peek at that. And it's inside the deployment process.ocl file. And so as we run that, it's going to integrate over for a project that is referenced. Now, if I just go back, notice that the release number in Octopus Create Release, the release number is the build number. It makes your life easy. Now, you can do whatever you want, but it does make your life easy if you have really good traceability all the way back to source control and be serious about that build number. So not only is the build going to be generated as such, maybe 1.0 whatever the build number is, and make that your template. But as we go forward into Octopus, you notice the release number is that exact build number that we have full traceability all the way through. Now you can add additional markers and whatnot and go to town, but make sure that that build number is inside your release number so that you have traceability. Okay. And as we go forward, I want to highlight one other part of the process, and that is where full system testing fits and how we do trunk-based development. Because if I go back to Octopus Deploy, you notice that Octopus knows that we're on the master branch. Why? Because Octopus is branch aware. And the configuration for the Octopus project is in source control. So if we are branching for a particular feature, and this feature has something new that has to be deployed, or something about one of the deployable components needs to change, guess what? We can change the Octopus project configuration right there, and it will be on our feature branch. It won't affect how builds from the master branch will be deployed just yet, until we actually go through our pull request process and get that merged into master. And so Octopus is feature branch aware. And that's important because it didn't always used to be that way. That's the new config as code capabilities. And so if we look at the flow as we're going through here, all these different activities happen in various places. So way back in requirements and design, we're going to specify the test scenarios that cause a particular new feature to be done. Then on the engineer workstation, we're going to change the code. We're going to run our private build locally. Then we're going to commit and push that code up to our Git repository. Then on the build server, in this case in Azure Pipelines, we are going to run our continuous integration build. It's going to run our unit tests, our component level integration tests, our static analysis. And then still from what was created on the feature branch that we're working on, in our TDD environment, we're going to do our deployment. And Octopus Deploy is going to deploy the packages that were created from the build on our feature branch and deploy to our TDD environment. And then we're going to run our automated full system tests. And I am serious. This is on a feature branch. Why do we do this? Because it doesn't make any sense to submit a pull request if our application is broken. And if we have full system acceptance tests, we don't actually know if all of those tests are still passing with what we changed until we run the tests. And with this automation, it's so easy to run those tests that have to be run against a fully deployed instance of the application and just have it do automatically. And of course, those tests pass. Then we create our pull request, and then this is outside of scope of this, we do our pull request inspection and merge it into master. And then in master, the build kicks off again for a GA level build off the master branch, and then does the deployment. Octopus kind of does the deployment, passes control back to Azure Pipelines. Azure Pipelines runs the tests, and then now we're ready to move on to a manual test environment. Okay, so I want to show you that step in kind of interactively. All right, so if we come over to pipelines, I have, actually, I'll show you how I click into it. I'm clicking on the 100% test passed, all right? And it gives me this view, and I can show in detail all of the different tests. And if I just hide this for screen real estate, I can click on one of these, and it shows me more detail about it passing. But one interesting thing that's really easy and useful to enable is test attachment. And if I just expand this out, this is this particular test. And that's about as big as I can make it right there. You can see this is the screen, and every step of the test, I've taken another screenshot and I've attached it as a test artifact. And so actually, I haven't shown you the application running yet. It's just a Blazor application, but we have full system test to make sure that as we click, this counter actually works. And we are not kind of messing with any of that yet, but just the counter. So if I go here and go to step 2, I click on the counter, count number 1. Step number 3 is clicking on it again, and this step does it 5 times. And we can see the screenshot, what's happening. Now, when one of these tests fails, it's always a question in our mind, well, what happened? What did the screen look like when the test failed? Well, if every step of the way you're just capturing a screenshot and storing it there, you know exactly what the screen looked like. So that's hugely valuable. Okay, so now before I kind of sum up this, let me just kind of go through and talk about some of the tricks in our Octopus project that are really useful. Okay, we have our process here, and I love using this designer because it's super easy to see what's going on, while at the same time, I can see exactly in detail all of the configuration in source. But when given a choice between kind of parsing the source and the designer, it is just so easy to look at this designer, and everything is high fidelity. It's not like Azure Pipelines where they literally got rid of their designer and now you have to just go spelunking through the YAML. I still like working with the designer. So this is a Azure container app, and we picked this because it's one of the really new Azure services. And with Octopus, you can deploy absolutely any type of application to absolutely anywhere. Now, here's the wrinkle. Azure Container Apps is really new. So while the Octopus team is working on built-in step templates for deploying Azure Container Apps, and it'll be just as easy as everything else that's in the library, it's super new, and there's not a built-in step template that's built out yet, but it doesn't actually matter. Let me show you why. So for deploying, and I'm glossing over the infrastructure as code aspect because you can see this create container app environment where we're deploying an Azure Resource Manager template. We're actually having Azure create this from scratch. Then we're creating the container app from scratch. And then we're getting the URL that Azure gave us. But I don't have time to go into that. When you deploy a revision, you actually add a container revision to the app. And even if you're deploying somewhere that is a super new cloud service and there's no built-in step template just yet in the Octopus library, which is huge, all it takes is running the command line. So I'm just going to show you this and full screen on this guy. There we go. This literally AZ container app update, and here's the container app name, and we're updating it to a particular image tag. Okay, that's the command line for deploying it, and then one additional command line right below to set an environment variable, which in this case the application needs a connection string to the database. And so we're setting the connection string that it needs to a particular variable. Okay, that's all it takes to deploy this particular Azure resource. And with Octopus, you have all of the structure around this. So in this case, not a built-in step template just yet, no problem. It's a simple command line to do it. And we have all of the power of the variables and the process so that we still have a good structure around it. And overall, we can still see what's happening. Okay. I'm going to just jump back here and talk about your method of thinking when configuring Octopus Deploy across these different environments. Here's the key thing. Do not do any activity, any deployment step, any deployment activity in production for the first time. Everything that you execute against production, you want to make sure that you have practiced it and run it against environments before production. By the time we're deploying to production, every step that's important has been exercised and proven to be stable. And so this chart shows just some of the really common things like migrating the database, deploying the application itself, running a health check, loading static data. If you have a drop down of different regions in your area that you are able to ship products to, maybe a new region comes online, that's static data, and then the rest of them, like running acceptance tests, recreating the database, you don't do that in production. So think of that for yourself. Now, I talked about the check version and the health check. This is just part of the process there. It literally is just running that PowerShell script that I showed you that calls into the application. And so if I were to show you that again in the application, literally we have a web service / version that just gives us back the version of the application. And then with the health check library, it literally is _health check and it's healthy. Now, why did it return back healthy versus unhealthy? Well, it's because all of these health check classes return back healthy. And in this case, we actually did make a round trip to the database in this particular environment to make sure that after deployment, the application starts up. And not only is the web server up, but every one of its dependencies are actually online and reachable, and the application's actually ready to go. That's what it means, okay? All right, so that was the deep dive. And I want to kind of pass it back to John for some more information on the state of software delivery and some of those studies that we have.
Yeah, awesome demo. I love seeing others demo Octopus because I'm usually the one demoing it. So watching someone else demo is always fun. This is another report that was put out by Circle CI entitled "The State of Software Delivery," and I think that reports like this also provide great context. Right? It's one thing to use the tools, but it's another thing to also keep aware of what others are seeing in the industry. So in the next slide, there's a summary of what they found in their report, which is basically, things that are critical for you as an organization when deploying software include things like, what are some of the things that determining your success rate? What is your throughput? What's your MTTR or your mean time to recovery? And there's a list of your median performance that was observed in the report itself, and then there's what they would classify as the elite benchmark. These actually do align quite closely to what the DORA metrics have, the State of DevOps report has found in the latest version of that report. And so what you're trying to do is try to align your organization to those DevOps practices, and utilizing a tool like Azure DevOps, Azure Pipelines, Octopus Deploy will help you achieve very close to these types of metrics. Now, of course, that's just one aspect of it. Build pipelines and deployment, those are two critical aspects of software development, but there's other aspects as well. So take into account all of those things when considering those aspects for your CI/CD pipelines. So I just wanted to give you that as an example of something that you could probably achieve to. This is like looking at the Health or Fitness magazine. Okay, where do I stack rank relative to that? But in terms of your organization fitness relative to software development, this will give you some guidelines.
Now, as we kind of come to the end of the demo and the presentation here, one of the offers that we have on the table is a free consultation regarding automated deployments. Whether you've implemented Octopus Deploy and just start thinking, you know what, I know we're missing something. My project and my configuration doesn't look quite like I just saw, and you just want a second set of eyes, or that you want to get automated deployments in your team, just give us a call. That's what we're here for. John and his team put out a great product that does the job really, really well. And our job is to make people successful with the practices of automated DevOps with Octopus kind of powering that automation. So we're available, but we have a few minutes left. And I think John answered some questions in the chat, but if anyone has an additional question, you want to put it in the Q&A window, we'll kind of open it up for questions there. And one of the questions that that always gets asked is, how does integrating with Octopus Deploy differ in Azure Pipelines versus GitHub Actions? And there actually is a capabilities difference in Azure Pipelines and GitHub Actions. Now, we may be talking a year from now, and GitHub Actions may have completely closed this gap because they're investing tremendously. But Azure Pipelines, for straightforward deployments to Azure Pipelines has some built-in stuff for that, but you quickly outgrow it and you need to graduate to a more powerful tool like Octopus. But because Azure Pipelines built that out, they can model all of your, at least the names of your environment. You can model all the stages all the way to production. And that's how we can see our environments, and then we can delegate to Octopus Deploy and then return control back to Azure Pipelines for the running of tests, because build servers run tests, not deployment servers. With GitHub Actions, they haven't built out that much yet. And so for GitHub Actions, it's still more straightforward after your build to use the built-in action for creating the release and sending it to Octopus, but then use the Octopus dashboard to promote it across your environments.
Yeah, so what we've observed, because we're pretty agnostic when it comes to CI servers, we love them all basically. So Azure Pipelines is really good for an integrated experience, and it integrates well across the board. However, the real power, I think, with GitHub Actions is its marketplace. It is currently sitting at 19,000 integrated actions. GitHub is a collaboration platform. It makes total sense that would be its strength. Now, if you're looking for an integrated experience, Azure Pipelines is great. If you're looking for a collaborative experience that maybe has some things that you may be thinking about, like one example might be protection rules, right? So protection rules in GitHub Actions is a real strength there, because that's a collaborative environment, but also what's available through the marketplace as well. You're absolutely right. Environments is a bit of a tough one as well with GitHub Actions. It doesn't have the strongest story there. Whereas Azure Pipelines has a pretty good environment story. But yeah, these environments obviously differ in terms of form and function. So there's lots of things to look at it.
Awesome. Well, John, I think that's a wrap. This was fun. I enjoyed it. I hope all of the attendees got a lot of value. If there's any questions whatsoever, then just kind of reach out. We're happy to help you out. John, thank you for being my co-host.
Thank you very much. It was great to be here.
All right. Well, everybody, have a great evening. Farewell.